The morning sun peeked through the curtains of Eleanor Westfield's bedroom, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floor. She stirred under silk sheets, her hand reaching for her phone before the alarm could sound. Another day of meetings, with foundation directors and potential donors, awaited her. At 54, Eleanor had built a life many envied, a successful real estate empire, a charitable foundation that helped thousands, and a sprawling estate that graced the covers of home design magazines. But none of it mattered compared to her greatest joy, her son Michael. Eleanor swung her feet to the floor and slipped into her morning routine. Coffee first, always. As she padded down the hallway toward her kitchen, she passed the wall of photos chronicling Michael's life. From a toothless grin in kindergarten to his college graduation 5 years ago. Now 28, he'd grown into a thoughtful young man who had recently joined an investment firm downtown. "Mrs. Westfield, your schedule today includes the hospital board meeting at 11. Her assistant's voice came through the house intercom system. "And don't forget about the charity gala planning committee at 3. "Thank you, Rita," Eleanor replied, pouring her coffee into a ceramic mug Michael had made for her in middle school. Chipped on one side and painted with uneven blue stripes, it remained her favorite despite the collection of fine china in her cabinets. The house phone rang, unusual for 7:18 in the morning. Eleanor glanced at the caller ID. City Hospital. Probably about the upcoming fundraiser, she thought. "Hello. This is Eleanor Westfield." "Mrs. Westfield." The voice on the other end was formal, hesitant. "This is Dr. Chen from City Hospital Emergency Department." Something in his tone made Eleanor's hand tighten around her coffee mug. "I'm very sorry to inform you that your son, Michael Westfield, was brought in early this morning." The paramedics responded to a call from his neighbor, who found him unresponsive, in his apartment. The mug slipped from Eleanor's fingers, shattering against the marble floor. Coffee splashed across her bare feet, but she felt nothing. "Mrs. Westfield, are you there?" "There must be some mistake," she whispered. "I just spoke to him last night. I'm deeply sorry." Dr. Chen's voice softened. "The emergency team did everything possible, but they couldn't revive him. The initial assessment suggests cardiac arrest." "Cardiac arrest? He's 28 years old." Eleanor's voice rose. "That's impossible. Sometimes these things happen without warning, even in young people. We'll know more after further examination." Eleanor's legs gave way, and she sank to the floor, heedless of the broken ceramic cutting into her skin. "I need to see him." "Of course. We're at City Hospital. Someone will meet you at the emergency entrance." The next few hours passed in a blur. Eleanor somehow managed to dress herself, her fingers fumbling with buttons and zippers. Rita arrived to find her employer sitting stone-faced in the foyer, purse clutched in white-knuckled hands. "Mrs. Westfield, what's happened?" "Michael is gone." The words felt foreign on Eleanor's tongue. "I need to go to the hospital." Rita drove while Eleanor stared vacantly out the window. The city streets looked different somehow, sharper, harsher, as if the colors had been turned up too high. People walked along sidewalks laughing, checking phones, living their ordinary lives while her world collapsed. At the hospital, a social worker with kind eyes and a gentle voice led Eleanor through sterile hallways to a small private room. "Would you like someone to come in with you?" the woman asked. Eleanor shook her head. This moment belonged to her and Michael alone. When the door opened, Eleanor expected to feel something, a wave of grief perhaps, or denial. Instead, a strange numbness washed over her as she approached the table where her son lay covered with a white sheet up to his chest. He looked peaceful, as though asleep after one of his long research nights. Eleanor touched his cheek. Cold. So cold. This couldn't be Michael, who had always radiated warmth. "Oh, my boy," she whispered, brushing back a strand of hair from his forehead the way she had done when he was small. "What happened to you?" The doctor's explanation of sudden cardiac arrest in young adults sounded rehearsed, clinical. Words like arrhythmia and undiagnosed condition floated around Eleanor, but none of them made sense. Michael had always been healthy, swimming competitively through college, running half marathons for charity, meticulous about his annual checkups. We'll need to perform an autopsy, Dr. Chen explained. It's standard procedure in unexpected deaths like this. Eleanor nodded mutely. When can I take him home? The next few days passed in a haze of paperwork, phone calls, and decisions no mother should have to make. Burial or cremation? Which funeral home? What would Michael have wanted? Eleanor moved through these tasks with mechanical precision, as if handling one of her business acquisitions rather than her son's final arrangements. The funeral director, a solemn man with practiced sympathy, guided her through choices of caskets and service options. Eleanor selected the most elegant mahogany casket lined with cream-colored silk. Michael always appreciated quality craftsmanship, she said, running her fingers along the polished wood. When the autopsy report came back 3 days later, it confirmed the initial diagnosis: sudden cardiac arrest due to an undetected congenital heart defect, a ticking time bomb that had been inside him since birth. It could have happened at any time, the medical examiner explained gently. There would have been no warning signs. But something about it didn't sit right with Eleanor. She requested Michael's medical records and spent a sleepless night reviewing them in her home office, coffee cups accumulating as dawn approached. His last physical, just 3 months ago, showed a healthy heart. How could such a significant defect have been missed? The morning of the wake, Eleanor stood in Michael's childhood bedroom, now preserved as his occasional guest room when he stayed over for Sunday dinners or holiday weekends. His high school swimming trophies still lined the bookshelf. A framed photo of Michael with his college roommates sat on the dresser. Eleanor picked it up, studying the faces of the young men who had shared his life. One face in particular caught her attention: James, Michael's best friend since their freshman year. In the photo, James had his arms slung around Michael's shoulders, both laughing at some forgotten joke. Where was James now? Eleanor realized she hadn't heard from him since Michael's death. Her phone chimed with a text message from the funeral director, confirming final arrangements for the evening's wake. Eleanor set down the photo and opened Michael's closet, running her fingers across his suits. He should wear his favorite navy blue one, she decided. As she pulled it from the hanger, something fell from the pocket, a small notebook with a worn leather cover. Eleanor hadn't seen it before. She flipped it open, finding pages filled with Michael's neat handwriting. Most entries were mundane: meeting notes, to-do lists, phone numbers. But the final page, dated just 3 days before his death, contained a single line: "Meeting with Jay must show him what I found." Eleanor slipped the notebook into her purse. Perhaps James would be at the wake. Perhaps he would know what Michael had found. The funeral home filled with people by early evening: colleagues from Michael's firm, friends from college, beneficiaries of Eleanor's charitable work who had known Michael since childhood. Eleanor stood beside the closed casket, accepting condolences with quiet dignity. He was too young, people murmured. Such a shock. If there's anything we can do. Eleanor nodded mechanically, searching the room for James. He arrived late, slipping in through a side door, looking haggard and uncomfortable in an ill-fitting suit. When he finally approached Eleanor, his eyes were red-rimmed and wouldn't quite meet hers. "Mrs. Westfield, I'm so sorry about Michael. He was the best friend I ever had. Thank you for coming, James." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "Michael valued your friendship deeply. I found a notebook of his today. The last entry mentioned meeting with you." James stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Did it? I don't recall any specific meeting. We were always catching up, you know. He said he needed to show you something he found." James swallowed hard. "Maybe it was about the Johnson account. We were both working on it." Before Eleanor could press further, the funeral director appeared at her elbow, murmuring about dinner arrangements for after the service tomorrow. By the time Eleanor turned back, James had disappeared into the crowd. As the evening wound down, Eleanor overheard a hushed conversation between 2 young men from Michael's office, standing near a floral arrangement. "It doesn't make sense," one whispered. "Michael was worried about something last week. Said he'd found irregularities in the offshore accounts. "Keep your voice down," the other hissed. "This isn't the place." They moved away when they noticed Eleanor smiling awkwardly and offering stilted condolences. Driving home that night, Eleanor's mind raced. Irregularities in accounts, Michael's mysterious note, James's strange behavior. None of it aligned with the simple tragedy of a young man dying from an undetected heart condition. Eleanor stood in her kitchen, staring at Michael's belongings, collected from his apartment, his wallet, keys, phone, and watch all sealed in a hospital bag. She opened it and picked up his watch, an expensive timepiece she'd given him when he graduated college. The back was slightly loose, as if recently opened. On impulse, Eleanor pried it open further. Tucked inside was a tiny memory card. Tomorrow she would say her final goodbye to her son at the funeral. But tonight, Eleanor slipped the memory card into her computer, determined to uncover what Michael might have been trying to tell her. The truth, she was beginning to suspect, was far more complicated than what everyone believed. Eleanor's hands trembled as she inserted the tiny memory card into her laptop. The screen remained blank for several seconds before a window popped up showing a single folder labeled Insurance. Inside were dozens of files with dates as their names. She clicked on the most recent one, dated just 3 days before Michael's death. It was a spreadsheet filled with account numbers, transaction dates, and dollar amounts. Millions of them, flowing between companies with names she didn't recognize. At the bottom of the spreadsheet was a note. Third confirmation of pattern. Westwood Capital moving client funds through shell companies. Need more proof before going to authorities. Eleanor's breath caught. Westwood Capital was Michael's employer, the prestigious investment firm he had joined less than a year ago. Was he investigating his own company? She opened more files, each containing similar spreadsheets, screenshots of banking transactions, and notes in Michael's methodical handwriting. In one document he had written, "Gordon knows something. Watched him shred documents after hours." Gordon Hayes was Westwood's CFO and had sent an enormous bouquet of lilies to the wake with a card expressing his deepest sympathies. The final file was a voice recording. Eleanor clicked play, and Michael's voice filled her silent kitchen, adding, "This to my records in case anything happens. Hayes confronted me today, asked what I was doing accessing the Panama accounts. I played it off as a mistake, but I don't think he bought it. Someone followed me home from work. Staying with James tonight just to be safe. Going to show him everything tomorrow." The recording ended, and Eleanor sat frozen in her chair. Michael had been afraid. He'd been investigating something illegal at his firm. And the last person he was planning to see was James, who had acted so strangely at the wake. Eleanor checked the timestamp on the recording. 9:17 p.m. last Tuesday. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her call history. Michael had called her at 9:43 p.m. that same night, their last conversation. He had sounded tired but not frightened. He'd said nothing about staying with James or being followed. He'd told her he loved her before hanging up, something he didn't always remember to do. Had he already shown James his findings by then, or had something happened before he could? The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, startling Eleanor from her thoughts. In 7 hours, she would have to stand beside her son's casket and say her final goodbye. But now she wondered if she was burying more than her son. Perhaps she was burying the truth as well. Eleanor copied the files to her personal drive and slipped the memory card into her jewelry box. She wouldn't sleep tonight, but she needed to appear composed for tomorrow. The eyes of the entire city would be on her, including perhaps the eyes of those responsible for her son's death. Morning came too quickly. Eleanor moved through, her preparations mechanically, the black dress, the pearl earrings Michael had given her for her birthday, a touch of makeup to hide the sleeplessness in her eyes. Rita arrived to drive her to the funeral home, concern evident in her furrowed brow. "You look exhausted," Rita said gently. "Did you sleep at all?" "How could I?" Eleanor replied, staring out the car window at the rain that had started falling. Perfect funeral weather, she thought bitterly. The service was to begin at 10 a.m., but Eleanor had requested a private half-hour beforehand to sit with Michael one last time. The funeral director led her to the chapel where the closed mahogany Casket waited, surrounded by arrangements of white lilies and blue hydrangeas, Michael's favorite. "Take all the time you need," he said, closing the door softly behind him. Eleanor stood beside the casket, laying a hand on its polished surface. "I know, Michael," she whispered. "I found what you left for me. I don't understand it all yet, but I promise you I will find out what happened." She opened her purse and took out the small teddy bear that had been Michael's childhood comfort object, a worn, floppy thing named Mr. Buttons that had traveled with him to summer camps and college dorms before finally retiring to a shelf in his old bedroom. She had planned to place it in the casket with him, a private goodbye between mother and son. But now, holding the bear in her hands, Eleanor hesitated. If Michael had been investigating financial crimes at his firm, if he had been followed and, possibly, she couldn't bring herself to complete the thought. But if there was more to his death than a tragic medical event, then she needed to be absolutely certain that the man in the casket was her son. The thought struck her suddenly. What if it wasn't Michael in there at all? What if this was all an elaborate cover-up? It seemed absurd, the stuff of thriller movies, not real life. She had seen Michael at the hospital, touched his cold cheek. But doubt gnawed at her. The autopsy report had felt too neat, too convenient, and Michael had been worried enough to hide evidence inside his watch. Eleanor glanced at the chapel door, then carefully set down Mr. Buttons on a nearby chair. With trembling hands, she unfastened the clasps that held the casket lid closed. The funeral director had shown her how they worked when she selected the casket, explaining that they would be permanently sealed after the service. The heavy lid resisted slightly as she raised it, designed to open slowly and gracefully rather than fall back. Eleanor steeled herself as the inside of the casket was revealed inch by inch. First, the cream-colored silk lining. Then the lower half of a body in a navy suit, Michael's favorite. Then the hands folded peacefully over the stomach, the blue tie she had selected because it matched his eyes. And finally, Michael's face, serene and still. It was him. Of course it was him. His sandy hair, the small cleft in his chin, the faint freckles across his nose that had never faded from childhood. Eleanor exhaled slowly, feeling foolish for her moment of melodramatic suspicion. But as she reached to brush back a strand of hair from his forehead, a final motherly gesture, her hand froze. There, just visible beneath his collar, was something she had never seen before. A small, crescent-shaped scar at the base of his neck. Michael had no such scar. Eleanor had bandaged every childhood wound, kissed every scrape and bruise. She had sat beside him through chickenpox and a broken arm from a skateboarding accident. She knew every mark on her son's body, and this scar, this fresh-looking pink scar, was not his. Her heart pounding, Eleanor carefully pulled back the collar to get a better look. The scar was surgical, precise, recent. The chapel door opened and Eleanor quickly lowered the casket lid, not fully closing it. "Mrs. Westfield?" It was the funeral director. "The guests are beginning to arrive. Would you like a few more minutes?" Eleanor composed her face, turning to him with the practiced social smile she had perfected over decades of charity galas and business functions. "No, thank you. I'm ready now." As the chapel filled with mourners, Eleanor sat in the front row, her mind racing. The person in that casket looked exactly like Michael except for that scar. Could she have somehow missed it all these years? Impossible. A mother doesn't miss something like that. Could it have been from the autopsy? But why would they make an incision there? Throughout the service, Eleanor barely heard the minister's words or the eulogies from Michael's colleagues and friends. She nodded at appropriate moments, accepted tissues she didn't use, and kept her gaze fixed on the casket that now held a stranger wearing her son's face. James sat 3 rows behind her. She could feel his eyes on her back. Gordon Hayes from Westwood Capital was there too, solemn-faced in an expensive suit, his wife beside him dabbing at dry eyes with a handkerchief. When it came time for Eleanor to speak, She walked to the podium with a steady step that belied the chaos in her mind. The speech she had prepared the day before now seemed irrelevant. Instead, she looked out at the sea of faces, some genuinely grieving, others merely performing the social obligation of attending, and made a decision. "My son," she began, her voice clear and unwavering, "was a man of principle. From childhood, he believed in justice and truth above all else. When he saw something wrong, he couldn't look away or pretend he hadn't seen it." She paused, noting how Gordon Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Michael often told me that the most important question we can ask ourselves is, what would I do if I weren't afraid?" It guided his decisions, his career, his relationships. Eleanor smiled slightly. "It's guiding me now." Several people exchanged confused glances. "As we say goodbye to Michael today, I make this promise. I will live by his principle. I will not look away from uncomfortable truths. I will not be silenced by fear." She returned to her seat as murmurs rippled through the gathering. The funeral director, looking slightly flustered by the departure from traditional remembrances, quickly announced that the service would conclude with a viewing before the casket was sealed for burial. Eleanor watched as mourners filed past the casket, paying their final respects. James hung back, waiting until most others had passed before approaching. When he reached the casket, he paused longer than others had, his shoulders tense. Then he turned, his eyes meeting Eleanor's briefly before he hurried toward the exit. Gordon Hayes passed by the casket without stopping, a hand at his wife's elbow hurrying her along. As the last of the mourners returned to their seats, the funeral director moved to close the casket for the final time. Eleanor stood. "Wait," she said, her voice ringing through the chapel. "I'd like to say one more goodbye." She approached the casket as whispers followed her. The funeral director stepped aside, a practiced look of respect on his face. Eleanor knew she had perhaps 30 seconds before propriety would demand she step away. 30 seconds to confirm what she already knew in her heart. Eleanor reached into the casket, ostensibly to place Mr. Buttons next to her son. As she did, she leaned close, as if giving a final kiss. With one hand, she discreetly pulled the collar back farther than she had before, revealing more of the neck and upper shoulder. The scar extended further than she had initially seen, forming a neat surgical line that disappeared beneath the suit, a line that would be consistent with a procedure no autopsy would require. Eleanor straightened, clutching Mr. Buttons instead of leaving him behind. "This isn't my son," she whispered, too low for anyone but the funeral director to hear. His expression of sympathy faltered. "Mrs. Westfield, grief can—" "I'm not confused," Eleanor cut him off, her voice now loud enough for the front rows to hear. "And I'm not saying goodbye today after all." She turned to face the stunned mourners, her eyes finding Gordon Hayes, who was already standing as if preparing to leave. "Because this man," she announced, pointing back at the casket, "is not Michael Westfield." A stunned silence fell over the chapel. Eleanor stood firm, her hand still pointing at the casket, her accusation hanging in the air like a thunderclap. The funeral director stepped forward, reaching for her elbow with a practiced, gentle touch. "Mrs. Westfield, please, this is a difficult time for everyone. Perhaps we should step outside for a moment." Eleanor shook him off, her eyes never leaving Gordon Hayes, who had frozen halfway to the exit. "I want answers," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "Starting with why there's a surgical scar on this man's neck that my son never had." Murmurs rippled through the gathering. A few people stood to get a better view of what was happening. Someone whispered about calling for medical help. Eleanor. It was Thomas Reed, her family lawyer for over 20 years, making his way to the front. "What's going on?" "Look for yourself, Thomas." Eleanor gestured to the open casket. "That's not Michael." Thomas glanced uncomfortably at the assembled mourners, many of whom were now openly staring or whispering behind their hands. "Eleanor, grief can cause—" "Don't you dare suggest I'm confused by grief," Eleanor snapped. "I know my own son." She turned back to the casket and, before anyone could stop her, pulled down the collar of the suit further to expose the surgical scar. Michael never had this. Never. Thomas peered at the mark, his professional composure faltering for just a moment. That does look recent. Mrs. Westfield. A new voice spoke up. Dr. Chen, who had been seated in the back of the chapel, approached cautiously. The autopsy would have created incisions, but they wouldn't be visible there. They're typically... I know where autopsy incisions are made, Eleanor interrupted. My foundation funded the new pathology wing at City Hospital, if you recall. This is something else entirely. The funeral director was now frantically signaling to his assistants, clearly hoping to regain control of the situation. Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps we should take a short recess while Mrs. Westfield... While Mrs. Westfield what? Eleanor challenged. While I calm down. While you close this casket and rush it away before anyone else can see what I've seen? She scanned the room, noting who looked genuinely shocked and who appeared nervous. Gordon Hayes was edging toward a side door now, his wife clutching his arm with a bewildered expression. James remained rooted to his seat, his face ashen. Eleanor made a swift decision. She pulled out her phone and snapped several photos of the scar before anyone could react. Then she addressed the room again, her voice steady and clear. Something is very wrong here. My son was investigating financial crimes at Westwood Capital before he died. He feared for his safety. And now I find that the body at his funeral isn't even him. She looked directly at Dr. Chen. I want an independent autopsy, immediately. A commotion broke out near the back of the chapel as two men in dark suits entered. They weren't part of the funeral home staff. Their posture and alertness marked them as something else entirely. Security? Law enforcement? One of them spoke quietly into a wrist microphone as they surveyed the room. The other locked eyes with Gordon Hayes, giving him a small nod. Eleanor noticed the exchange and quickly turned to Thomas. Call Detective Lopez, she whispered. The one who handled the break-in at my house last year. Tell her to come right away. Thomas hesitated only briefly before stepping away to make the call. Eleanor turned back to face the room, raising her voice to be heard above the growing commotion. I'd like everyone to stay until the authorities arrive. Her gaze hardened as she looked at Gordon Hayes and the mysterious men. This funeral is now a crime scene. Several people stood to leave, creating a wave of movement toward the doors. The men in suits made no move to stop them, but one positioned himself near Gordon, who had gone very still. The funeral director was practically wringing his hands now. Mrs. Westfield, please. We can't hold people here against their will. There are other services scheduled today. Perhaps if we close the casket and continue this discussion privately, the casket stays open, Eleanor insisted, and anyone who leaves before the police arrive will have some very difficult questions to answer later. Her words had the desired effect. Most of the mourners settled back into their seats, though a few still hovered uncertainly near the exits. No one wanted to appear guilty by fleeing. James finally rose from his seat and approached Eleanor hesitantly. Mrs. Westfield, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. There's something you should know. Before he could continue, the chapel doors burst open again. This time it was Detective Carla Lopez, accompanied by two uniformed officers. Thomas must have emphasized the urgency of the situation. Mrs. Westfield, Detective Lopez nodded curtly as she approached. Your lawyer says you've discovered something concerning. My son's body has been switched, Eleanor said without preamble. This isn't Michael. To her credit, Detective Lopez didn't dismiss the claim outright. Instead, she approached the casket and examined the body carefully, paying particular attention to the scar Eleanor pointed out. When did you last see your son's body? Lopez asked. At the hospital morgue 4 days ago, Eleanor replied. There was no scar then, I'm certain. Lopez turned to the funeral director. Who had access to the body after it left the hospital? The man swallowed nervously. Standard procedure. Our preparation team, myself, no one else. That's not entirely accurate, a new voice interjected. It was one of the suited men, now standing at the edge of the small group. He pulled out an ID card. Agent Paul Wilson, Federal Bureau of Investigation. A hushed silence fell over the chapel. "This matter concerns national security," Agent Wilson continued. "I need to speak with Mrs. Westfield privately." Detective Lopez stepped between them. "This is potentially a local homicide investigation now. I'd like to understand the FBI's interest." Agent Wilson's jaw tightened. "I'm not at liberty to discuss that in this setting." Eleanor looked between them, pieces starting to fall into place. "This is about what Michael discovered at Westwood, isn't it? The money laundering." Agent Wilson's expression didn't change, but his silence was confirmation enough. "Was Michael working with you?" Eleanor pressed, her voice rising. "Did you recruit my son as some kind of informant?" "Mrs. Westfield," Wilson said quietly, "this really isn't the place." "It's exactly the place," Eleanor fired back. "That's not my son in that casket, and I want to know why. Where is Michael?" The question hung in the air. The second FBI agent had now moved to stand beside Gordon Hayes, who looked like he might be sick. James stepped forward again. "Michael contacted me last week," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "He said he'd found something big at work, something illegal. He was scared." "Did he show you what he found?" Eleanor asked. James nodded. "Financial records, offshore accounts, millions of dollars being moved for people who shouldn't have that kind of money." "Money laundering," Detective Lopez stated. "Among other things," James confirmed. "Michael said he was going to the authorities with it." All eyes turned to Agent Wilson, who remained stoically silent. "So he came to you," Eleanor said to Wilson. "And then he ended up dead. Except that's not even him in the casket." The chapel doors opened once more, and a woman in a crisp pantsuit entered, flanked by 2 more agents. She surveyed the scene with calm authority before approaching. "I'm Assistant Director Catherine Bell," she announced. "This situation has escalated beyond what we anticipated. Mrs. Westfield, I understand your distress, but I need to ask everyone else to leave now." "I'm not going anywhere," Eleanor stated firmly. "Not until I know what happened to my son." Bell considered this, then nodded. "Detective Lopez and Mr. Reed may stay as representatives of local law enforcement and your legal counsel. Everyone else needs to exit the building." The funeral director began ushering people out, relieved to have someone else taking charge. The officers assisted, directing the confused mourners toward the exits. James hesitated, but a look from Agent Wilson sent him on his way. Gordon Hayes was escorted out separately by one of the agents, his wife following in tearful confusion. When the chapel held only Eleanor, Thomas, Detective Lopez, and the federal agents, Assistant Director Bell spoke again. "Mrs. Westfield, what I'm about to tell you is classified. You'll need to sign non-disclosure agreements before leaving here today." She paused, making sure Eleanor understood the gravity of the situation. "Your son came to us 3 months ago with evidence of a massive money laundering operation at Westwood Capital. The firm was cleaning money for several international criminal organizations, including terrorist groups." Eleanor felt her knees weaken. Thomas quickly pulled a chair forward for her to sit. "Michael agreed to work with us," Bell continued. "He was gathering evidence from the inside, building a case that would hold up in court. But last week he believed his cover had been compromised. Gordon Hayes was growing suspicious." "So what happened to him?" Eleanor demanded. "If that's not Michael in the casket, where is he?" Bell and Wilson exchanged glances. "Mrs. Westfield," Bell said carefully, "your son is alive." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She gripped the arms of her chair, unable to speak. "When Michael realized he was in danger, we extracted him," Bell explained. "But the operation against Westwood wasn't complete. We couldn't afford to have the targets realize Michael had escaped with evidence against them. So you faked his death," Detective Lopez concluded, professional curiosity overriding her initial shock. "Yes," Bell acknowledged. "We needed the world, especially Gordon Hayes and his associates, to believe Michael Westfield was dead." "And the body?" Thomas asked. "Who is that person?" "It's not a real person," Wilson said. "It's a medical-grade simulation, synthetic tissues over a frame, advanced enough to pass casual inspection, even by a medical examiner who's been told what to expect. Eleanor stared at the casket, at the familiar face that wasn't her son after all. "A dummy," she whispered. "You were going to bury a dummy, and let me think my son was dead." "It was for his protection," Belle insisted. "And yours. If they believed you were genuinely grieving, no one would suspect you knew anything." "Where is he now?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely audible. "In protective custody," Belle replied. "At a secure location." Eleanor stood suddenly, anger flooding through her. "You had no right to put me through this hell." "Mrs. Westfield," Belle began. "No." Eleanor cut her off. "I don't care about your operation or your justifications. I want to see my son. Now." Belle shook her head. "That's not possible right now. The operation is at a critical stage. Any unusual behavior could alert Hayes and his associates." "Unusual behavior?" Eleanor laughed bitterly. "Like a mother announcing to a chapel full of people that the body in her son's casket isn't actually him? I think that ship has sailed." Wilson winced. "Yes, that complicates things." Eleanor crossed her arms. "Then uncomplicate them. Take me to Michael, or I go straight to every news outlet in the city with this story." Belle and Wilson exchanged another look. "Give us 24 hours, Belle finally said. "We need to secure the suspects and evidence. Then we can arrange a meeting." Eleanor considered this, then nodded once. 24 hours, not a minute more. She glanced back at the open casket. "And I want to know exactly what you plan to do with that thing." "Standard burial," Wilson admitted. Weight adjusted to seem realistic. The casket would be sealed permanently before interment. "And how long was this charade supposed to continue?" Thomas asked. How long would Mrs. Westfield have believed her son was dead? Belle at least had the grace to look uncomfortable. Until the operation concluded and all arrests were made, possibly several months. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, imagining the continued grief, the slow healing that would have been based on a lie. When she opened them again, her resolve was steel. 24 hours, she repeated. And then I want my son back. The 24 hours that followed were the longest of Eleanor's life. The funeral had been abruptly canceled, with bewildered guests told there was a family emergency. The casket containing the synthetic body was whisked away by FBI agents, leaving the funeral director stammering apologies to his other scheduled clients. Eleanor returned to her empty house, accompanied by Agent Wilson, who insisted on staying as security. Thomas Reed had reluctantly gone to his office to draft the non-disclosure agreements demanded by Assistant Director Bell, though he made Eleanor promise not to sign anything without his review. "Can I at least know if he's safe?" Eleanor asked Wilson as they sat in her kitchen. The agent had declined coffee but accepted water, which he hadn't touched. "He is," Wilson confirmed, his professional demeanor softening slightly. "Your son is very brave, Mrs. Westfield. The evidence he gathered has the potential to disrupt several dangerous organizations." Eleanor stared out the window at her garden, where the gardener was pruning roses as if it were any normal day. "Why didn't he tell me? We've never had secrets." Wilson shifted uncomfortably. "That was our requirement, not his. The fewer people who knew, the safer he would be." "I'm not people," Eleanor said sharply. "I'm his mother. Which is exactly why you were the most closely watched person in his life after he came to us," Wilson explained. "These organizations don't hesitate to use family as leverage. If they had suspected Michael was working with us, you would have been their first target." The thought chilled Eleanor. She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, seeking warmth. "So what happens now? This operation of yours is compromised because of what I did today." Wilson checked his phone, which had been buzzing periodically, with messages. "Actually, your actions accelerated our timeline. As we speak, teams are executing search warrants at Westwood Capital and the homes of several executives, including Gordon Hayes." "Good," Eleanor said firmly. "Will there be enough evidence without what Michael was still gathering?" "We believe so," Wilson nodded. "And your discovery today created an unexpected opportunity." Hayes panicked when you announced the body wasn't Michael. He made some calls he shouldn't have made, said things we've been recording. Sometimes fear makes people careless. A thought occurred to Eleanor. The memory card I found in Michael's watch. Was that part of your plan too? Wilson looked genuinely surprised. What memory card? Eleanor studied his face, then stood and retrieved the card from her jewelry box. This was hidden in the back of Michael's watch. It contained spreadsheets, voice recordings, transaction records, everything he was gathering about Westwood. Wilson took the tiny card with reverent care. This wasn't part of our arrangement. Michael was uploading data through a secure channel we established. He turned the card over in his fingers. This was his insurance policy. Smart kid. He's 30. Hardly a kid. Eleanor corrected automatically, the maternal response so ingrained it emerged even in these extraordinary circumstances. Wilson almost smiled. To some of us, ma'am, 30 still looks pretty young. The doorbell rang, startling them both. Wilson immediately tensed, one hand moving toward the gun Eleanor now noticed beneath his jacket. Are you expecting anyone? Eleanor shook her head. They moved to the security panel by the door, where a monitor displayed the front porch camera feed. Detective Lopez stood there alone. Wilson relaxed slightly and nodded. Eleanor opened the door. Detective, she greeted Lopez. Any news? Lopez glanced at Wilson, then back to Eleanor. I've been removed from the case officially, FBI jurisdiction, but I thought you should know they found something at Michael's apartment during the search. What kind of something? Wilson asked sharply. Surveillance equipment, Lopez replied. Sophisticated stuff. Hidden in light fixtures, smoke detectors, his whole place was bugged. Eleanor felt a chill run through her. Who put it there? That's for your people to determine, Lopez told Wilson. But whoever it was, they were listening. To every word your son said in his own home. Wilson was already on his phone, stepping away to speak in urgent, hushed tones. Lopez lowered her voice. There's something else. The medical examiner who signed off on your son's autopsy report, Dr. Price, he's gone. Cleaned out his bank accounts yesterday and disappeared. He was part of this, Eleanor realized. They paid him to fake the autopsy. Report. Lopez nodded. Looks that way. I'm still trying to trace where the fake body came from. Something that's sophisticated isn't easy to acquire. Wilson returned, his expression grim. Mrs. Westfield, we need to move you to a secure location immediately. Detective, thank you for the information, but this is now a federal matter. Lopez stood her ground. I understand that, Agent Wilson, but Mrs. Westfield is still my responsibility. As a citizen of this city, I'd like to know she'll be safe. The two law enforcement officers stared at each other in silent challenge until Eleanor intervened. I'm not going anywhere until I see Michael, she stated firmly. That was our agreement. 24 hours. Wilson checked his watch. 17 hours remaining. A lot can happen in 17 hours, Mrs. Westfield. Then make sure nothing does, Eleanor replied coolly. I'm staying right here. Wilson sighed. At least let us bring in additional security. Eleanor considered this, then nodded. Fine, but they stay outside. I won't be a prisoner in my own home. As Wilson stepped away again to make arrangements, Lopez touched Eleanor's arm gently. Be careful, she warned. I've seen cases like this before. Once the federal agencies take over, people like you and me become pieces on their chessboard. I appreciate your concern, Detective, Eleanor said. But right now, all that matters to me is seeing my son alive. After Lopez left, the house quickly filled with activity as security personnel arrived, setting up a perimeter and checking the grounds. Eleanor watched from her study window as men and women in tactical gear positioned themselves discreetly around her property. Night fell. Eleanor couldn't sleep. She sat in Michael's old room instead, surrounded by the remnants of his childhood. Trophies, books, the star chart still taped to his ceiling. Wilson had stationed himself in the hallway outside, his quiet presence both reassuring and irritating. Her phone rang just after midnight, Unknown number. Hello? Mrs. Westfield, it's Assistant Director Bell. There's been a development. Gordon Hayes is dead. Eleanor sat up straighter. Dead? How? Apparent suicide. His wife found him in his study an hour after our agents finished searching their home. Bell's voice was carefully neutral. He left a note confessing to arranging the surveillance of your son's apartment. Do you believe it was suicide? Eleanor asked. A pause. We're investigating all possibilities. What does this mean for Michael? It complicates things, Bell admitted. Hayes was our primary target, but he was working for someone higher up, someone we haven't identified yet. Eleanor closed her eyes, processing this. So Michael is still in danger? Potentially. Which is why we've moved up our timeline. A car will arrive for you in 20 minutes. Agent Wilson will accompany you. Eleanor glanced at her watch. Still 7 hours before their agreed meeting time. Where are you taking me? To Michael. Eleanor's heart leapt. I'll be ready. She changed quickly into practical clothes. Dark slacks, a sweater, comfortable shoes. No jewelry that could catch light or make noise. Years of charitable work in crisis zones had taught her how to dress for uncertain situations. Wilson met her at the bottom of the stairs. The car is almost here. We'll exit through the garage to avoid being seen. Is that really necessary? Eleanor asked. Who would be watching my house at this hour? Hayes might be dead, but his associates aren't, Wilson replied grimly. And they now know their operation is compromised. A sleek black SUV with tinted windows pulled into the garage 10 minutes later. Wilson checked the credentials of the driver before allowing Eleanor to enter the vehicle. The seats were leather, comfortable but not luxurious. Government issue, Eleanor thought. How far are we going? She asked as they pulled away. About an hour outside the city, Wilson replied. Safe house in a rural area. Eleanor watched through the windows as they left the city behind. Streetlights giving way to darkness broken only by their headlights. They turned onto progressively smaller roads until they were driving on what appeared to be a private lane, cutting through dense woods. The safe house, when they reached it, was a disappointment. A small plain cabin with security cameras mounted discreetly under the eaves. 2 more black SUVs were parked outside. Armed agents nodded to Wilson as he escorted Eleanor to the door. Inside, Assistant Director Bell was waiting, looking as crisp and composed at 2 a.m. as she had in the chapel earlier that day. Mrs. Westfield, thank you for coming. As if I had a choice, Eleanor replied. Where is Michael? Bell gestured to a closed door off the main room. Through there. He's been briefed on the situation. She handed Eleanor a document. But before you see him, I need you to sign this. Thomas Reed's warning echoed in Eleanor's mind, but the thought of seeing Michael, alive, breathing, overrode all caution. She took the pen Bell offered and signed without reading. Bell took the paper and nodded to Wilson, who opened the door. Eleanor stepped through, her heart pounding. The room was small, furnished only with a bed, a desk, and a chair. And there, standing by the window, was Michael, her son, alive. He turned at the sound of the door, his face lighting up with a mixture of joy and regret. Mom. Eleanor crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled him into her arms. He felt real, solid, warm, his heart beating against hers. She held him tightly, afraid he might disappear again if she let go. I'm so sorry, Michael whispered against her hair. I wanted to tell you. Eleanor finally pulled back enough to look at his face, her hands framing his cheeks as if to reassure herself he was really there. You're alive. That's all that matters. Right now. Michael looked thinner than she remembered, with dark circles under his eyes and several days' worth of stubble on his jaw. His hair was different too, shorter, darker. Part of his disguise, she realized. Are you okay? She asked, scanning him for any sign of injury. Have they been treating you well? Michael nodded. I'm fine, just tired of hiding. He led her to sit on the edge of the bed. Mom, how did you know? About the body? There was a scar, Eleanor explained. On the neck of whoever, whatever, that was in your casket. I knew it wasn't you. Michael touched his own neck reflexively. I never thought they'd try to use a synthetic. The plan was supposed to be closed casket, immediate cremation. Well, I insisted on seeing you one last time, Eleanor said. Thankfully. A knock on the door interrupted them. Wilson poked his head in. Sorry, but we need to debrief now. The situation is evolving. Michael sighed but nodded. We're coming. They returned to the main room, where Belle was spreading files on a small table. Photographs of Gordon Hayes and several other men Eleanor didn't recognize. Michael Hayes is dead, Belle said without preamble. Apparent suicide, but we're treating it as suspicious. Michael paled. That means they're cleaning house. Anyone who could connect them to Westwood is a liability now. Connect who? Eleanor asked. Michael and Belle exchanged glances. We believe Westwood was laundering money for several clients, Belle explained carefully, including a foreign intelligence service operating through shell companies. Eleanor felt a chill. So this isn't just about financial crimes anymore. It never was, Michael said quietly. That's why I had to disappear. These people don't just fire employees who cross them, Mom. They eliminate problems permanently. Wilson's phone buzzed. He checked it, then looked up with alarm. We've got movement on the perimeter, multiple vehicles approaching from the South Access Road. Belle immediately shifted into command mode. How many? At least 3 vehicles. No headlights. Belle turned to Michael and Eleanor. We need to move you now, out the back to the secondary location. Michael took Eleanor's hand. Stay close to me. As they moved toward a rear exit, Eleanor realized with startling clarity that her life had irrevocably changed. The comfortable, predictable existence she had built was gone. Now she was running, through the night with her not-dead son, pursued by killers with international connections. And strangely, despite the danger, she felt more alive than she had in years. 6 months had passed since the night Eleanor and Michael fled the safe house. 6 months of new identities, different cities, and constant vigilance. 6 months of a life Eleanor could never have imagined for herself. She stood at the window of their current apartment, a modest 2-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood far from their former lives. The morning sun cast long shadows across the street where children waited for the school bus, their normal lives continuing undisturbed by the kind of dangers that had upended hers. Coffee? Michael appeared beside her, holding out a steaming mug. His hair was longer now, lightened by the sun. A beard covered the lower half of his face. Few would recognize him as the clean-cut investment banker from the life they'd left behind. Thanks. Eleanor accepted the mug, smiling at her son. Despite everything, she couldn't regret any of it. He was alive. They were together. The rest was just details. The burner phone on the counter rang, its harsh tone cutting through the peaceful morning. Michael answered it, his posture immediately tensing. Yes, she's here, he said, glancing at Eleanor. I understand. We'll be ready. He hung up and took a deep breath before turning to her. That was Belle. They've arrested Kwan. Eleanor set down her coffee. Victor Kwan had been the missing piece, the connection between Westwood Capital and the foreign operatives who had used the firm to launder their money. For months, the FBI had been hunting him while simultaneously keeping Michael and Eleanor hidden from Kwan's associates. What does this mean for us? She asked. It means we might be able to go home, Michael said, a cautious hope in his voice. Kwan was the last major player. With him in custody, the immediate threat is contained. Eleanor absorbed this news silently. Home. The word sounded strange now, almost foreign. What was home anymore? Her beautiful house with its carefully tended gardens felt like something from another lifetime. Belle wants us to come in, Michael continued. They're arranging transport now. 3 hours later, they sat in a conference room at the FBI field office in a city they'd never visited before. Assistant Director Belle looked older than Eleanor remembered, the months of leading the investigation having taken their toll. Victor, Kwan has been officially charged with conspiracy, money laundering, and 2 counts of murder. Bell informed them, including the murder of Gordon Hayes. So it wasn't suicide, Eleanor said. No, Bell confirmed. Hayes was killed to prevent him from talking. Kwan's organization was thorough in covering their tracks, but not thorough enough. What about the others? Michael asked. The people Hayes was working with at Westwood? Bell slid a folder across the table. 8 indictments so far, more pending as we follow the money trail. Your evidence was crucial, Michael. The recordings, the transaction records, they provided the foundation for the entire case. Michael nodded, but Eleanor could see the conflict in his eyes. He had given up everything to expose this criminal network. His career, his identity, nearly his relationship with his mother. So what happens now? Eleanor asked. Bell folded her hands on the table. That's why we wanted to meet in person. You have options to consider. The options, as Bell outlined them, were limited but better than continued hiding. Option 1. New permanent identities in a new country, with reasonable financial support from the government. A complete break from their past lives. Option 2. Return to their real identities but with ongoing security measures and certain limitations. They would never be completely free of surveillance, both for their protection and as a precaution against any remaining threats. Take some time to discuss it, Bell said, rising from the table. I'll give you privacy. When the door closed behind her, Eleanor turned to Michael. What do you think? Michael rubbed his beard thoughtfully. Part of me wants to take the new identities, start completely fresh somewhere no one knows us. He glanced at her. But I know how much your work means to you, your foundation, your friends. Eleanor thought about the life she'd built over decades. The charitable foundation that supported education for underprivileged children, the hospital wing that bore her family name, the networks of people who depended on her leadership and resources. We could do good work anywhere, she said carefully. Build something new. Michael studied her face. But, Eleanor sighed. Running forever doesn't feel right. These people took so much from us already. Your career, our peace of mind, 6 months of our lives. I don't want to give them the rest of our future, too. Michael reached across the table and took her hand. So we go back. We go back, Eleanor nodded. But on our terms. When Bell returned, they laid out their conditions. Yes, they would resume their real identities, but they wanted input on the security arrangements. They wouldn't live in fear, constantly looking over their shoulders, and they wanted complete transparency about any ongoing threats. I can work with that, Bell agreed. There's one more thing you should know. She hesitated, then continued. The story of what happened, Michael's fake death, the investigation, all of it. It's going to come out when the trials begin. The press will be all over it. Eleanor hadn't considered this aspect, but of course it made sense. The mysterious resurrection of Michael Westfield would be irresistible to the media. We'll handle it, she said with more confidence than she felt. We've dealt with worse. 2 weeks later, Eleanor stood once again on the steps of her home. The gardens had grown wild in her absence, but the house itself had been maintained by the FBI, who had used it occasionally for surveillance operations. Strange, isn't it? Michael said beside her, looking up at the familiar facade. Coming back, Eleanor nodded. Like walking into a movie of our old lives. They had spent the past 2 weeks in debriefings, signing documents, and planning their public return. The official story was that Michael had been in witness protection after uncovering financial crimes, close enough to the truth to be believable, vague enough to protect sensitive details. As they stepped inside, Eleanor was struck by how unchanged everything was. The furniture, the paintings, even the stack of mail that had been collected and left neatly on the entry table. Yet everything felt different because she was different. I need to make some changes, she said, looking around at the formal, perfect decor that now felt cold and impersonal. Me too, Michael agreed. Starting with a new job far away from finance. What are you thinking? Michael smiled. Maybe teaching. Economics at a community college. Something that matters. Eleanor felt a surge of pride. Her son had always been brilliant, But now he had a depth and purpose she hadn't seen before. As they settled in, the reality of their new normal became clearer. The security detail was discreet but omnipresent. Agents posing as gardeners, housekeepers, and neighbors. Weekly briefings on potential threats. Protocols for every public appearance. The media attention, when it came, was exactly as intense as Bell had warned. Photographers camped outside the gates. Headlines screamed about the Coffin conspiracy and Back from the Dead. Interview requests flooded in from every network and publication. Eleanor declined them all. This wasn't a story for public consumption. It was their life. Instead, she channeled her energy into restructuring her foundation, focusing its mission on supporting victims of financial crimes and their families. Michael worked alongside her while taking night classes to earn his teaching certification. 1 year to the day after Eleanor had opened Michael's coffin and discovered the truth, they stood together at a small, private memorial service. Not for Michael this time, but for the others who hadn't been so fortunate. Hayes's wife, who had taken her own life after the truth about her husband emerged. The junior analyst at Westwood who had been killed in what was staged as a mugging when he asked too many questions. The countless unnamed victims of the criminal enterprises that had been funded through the laundered money. Do you ever regret it? Eleanor asked Michael as they placed flowers at the small monument they had commissioned. Coming forward, exposing everything? Michael was quiet for a moment. Sometimes I regret the way it happened. The pain it caused. You thinking I was dead? He looked at her, his eyes serious. But no, I don't regret doing what was right. Eleanor slipped her arm through his as they walked back to the car where their security detail waited at a respectful distance. Neither do I, she said. Though I never would have chosen this path, it's taught me something important. What's that? Eleanor smiled. That some things are worth fighting for no matter the cost. Truth. Justice. She squeezed his arm. Family. As they drove away, Eleanor looked back at the memorial one last time. Their lives would never be what they once were. There would always be precautions, always be a shadow of risk. But they were together, and they were using their experience to help others. It wasn't the life she had planned. It was harder, more complicated, more dangerous. But in many ways, it was also more meaningful. The afternoon sun caught the engraving on the memorial stone as they turned onto the main road. The words were simple, but powerful, chosen by Eleanor herself. The truth is never buried forever.